have in this lecture pertains to Michael Howard's little piece. And if you have taken an international relations course, then you'll recognize some of the things that he's saying as very much sort of signature of realist theory. But you may know that there's different kinds of realism, and this piece would suggest that he's kind of an unwilling or hesitant realist. He doesn't really want to be saying negative things about human nature, for example. I don't think he's particularly convinced that human beings are warlike. In contrast to some of the theories we were looking at last week, there's no psychological drive here. There's no innate, natural human nature instinct to engage in war. So what's going on here? The originality of the piece, the contribution of the piece, if you will, is that in a sense he's saying that the causes of war in the immediate sense are kind of beside the point. There are various drives to war, as he says at the bottom of page 39 if you look at column 1, but it doesn't really matter what the drives are, because the problem, he says, is systemic. What he's trying to say when he says that is that we need to focus on not the immediate causes of war, but what I would term, and what realists in general term, the permissive causes of war. What is it that what makes war possible? There are contexts where the things that make war possible are the things that make anything possible, obviously, could be what I do to you. I give you a punch in the face and you might want to hit me back. So obviously that's a cause of war. But a permissive cause is what made it possible for me to take a swing at you in the first place. What kind of society was I living in? What kind of context, social structure, if you will, was I living in? So let me elaborate on that. What he means is that each war may have myriad motives, but the cause of war in general is what he's preoccupied with, and that's to do with the way global politics works. All of our relationships with each other seem to be channeled into the existence of these things called nation states. And what are nation states? They are centralized power units, right, where we give up a lot of our power as individual citizens, specifically our power to kill, our power of individual violence, my ability to have violence to use violence towards you. We give that all up, centralize it in what Thomas Hobbes, the famous philosopher, called common power, and out of that common power we constitute what we call the sovereign, our sovereignty. And sovereignty is the power that's over us to administer the police force and maintain law and order. Now we have that within the state, and that is a good thing, right? It allows the state to cohere as a unit. That's a viable unit in an international context, and we want that state to survive. We want that power, that common power, to continue, because it's the thing from which all our common good flows, right? If we don't have that common power exercising sovereignty over us, then we cannot have comfort. We cannot have luxury. We cannot have commerce. We can't have business. We can't have nice schools and fancy laptops, right? So sovereignty or peace and stability are critical. So we want the state to survive, to maintain, to continue to be able to maintain these things for us. So we can say on the basis of that not only is sovereignty a part of our world and centralized power, but also the survival instinct that we have in relationship to that sovereignty is to keep that thing going, right? To keep that state, to keep that sovereignty going. And that's, for people like Howard, the most basic primal drive of all global politics. So no matter, then, just think about that for a second. What that means is, it doesn't matter if you're a communist or a radical liberal or an environmentalist or an Islamist, or a culture based on the cult of the purple people eater. It really doesn't matter, right? You don't get to have your religious values, you don't get to have your ideological values, any of your preferences, right? You don't get to have any of them unless you balance your ambition to promote those values with the need to survive, the need to provision for your survival in an uncertain world. So this is the basic sort of pragmatic or pragmatist proposition of international politics, right? You may have different views of how the world you want the world to be. We can call that your ambition, right? You have loads of ambition for putting your desires into the world to create and craft the world the way you want it to see it. But those ambitions will come to nothing if you do not guarantee your survival. So there's an immediate kind of trade-off there. If you pursue your ambitions without any thought for the future, trying to push your views on other people, you may generate some antagonistic responses towards you. So you're going to have to put some limits on your ambition. And of course, look around the world today. This is a debate that's an active debate in the world today. Certain Republicans, for example, I notice in Congress argue that Iran is a terrible country that's out to, cause real mayhem in the world, and they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons because Iran is crazy and would certainly use them. But this perspective of Michael Howard's would give us some pause on that point, right? How dangerous would Iran be? Why would Iran be more suicidal than any other country, right? Again, it's that question of what nation states do is they specialize in survival, surviving into the future. Nation states often die, they get killed. This is kind of goes to the point of the Raymond Aron quote on page 40 of Michael Howard's text, where he says the stakes of war are the existence, the creation, or the elimination of states. The stakes of war are the existence, the creation, or the elimination of states, right? So there's a lot of things going on here. War is about survival, existence, creation, elimination of states. That's all very true, and we can't deny that. But coming back to the Iran example, why would Iran be any more likely or any less likely to take that quote seriously, right? Iran knows that that's true just as well as anyone else does. So, the broad history of international relations is a history of nation states pursuing their survival. It's incredibly rare for nation states not to pursue survival, and that means that they are always willing to compromise their values in order to live another day, so that their greater good, the principles and priorities for which they stand, will have a chance of surviving into the future. Their ideologies, their preferences are like their children, right? They will do anything for their children to survive, and that includes compromising, if needs be, on pursuing their ideological agendas. So, think about then Howard's arguments here and how different they are, for example, to Freud. Freud said that it was all about psychology, right? He was talking about the death drive, and it was kind of tragic, a tragic sense of human nature. Human nature had sort of cursed us or condemned us to live this way in this warlike manner. Well, Howard could not be more different, right? What's going on here is a lot less to do with human nature. It's much more to do with the fact that we live in a condition called anarchy, and we have to we have to understand this, but we have to understand it intellectually, and so think about terms, think about theories to model this anarchy for ourselves. And so, in the literature, Howard doesn't mention this, but in the type of literature that from the theoretical perspective he comes from, which is, I would argue, Neo-Realism. You guys don't need to know that term because it's not what we're covering in this class, but I thought it might be interesting to bring it up. That what he's describing effectively is the zero-sum game of anarchy, right? That the warlike nature of our planet, of our world, of our species is nobody's fault in particular. It's nothing to do with human nature. It's an accident almost of our fate, because we have channeled our existence into these vehicles that we call nation states, and because those nation states relate to each other and interact with each other in conditions of perpetual anarchy, what we have here is something much more like a behavioral structure that we can't escape. Not a behavioral structure of individual human beings, because individual human beings live in nation states where there's a police force. But in anarchy, there's no police force. And so we have no breaks or checks or balances, and we have a very uncertain sense of how to relate to each other, right? We can't predict day to day what our neighbor is going to be doing. In a domestic situation where we live and there's a police force and a judge and a court, we can kind of predict that our neighbor will toe the line because, and he can predict that we will toe the line because he has an incentive to, right? The legal system keeps our behavior in line, keeps us in check, and fear of punishment keeps us in check. But there's no such fear of a neutral arbitrator like a police force and a court system in the international relations sphere. So we do have this behavioral structure then that's different to the domestic sphere. Nation states exist in a different world than individual human beings. So in anarchy then, the interaction of nation states could be described by the model of, and it's described in the literature this way, of what we call the prisoner's dilemma, where you have two prisoners detained, held in separate rooms, and they're both being offered terms to try to get information out of them, and the police are kind of giving them this line that, well, if they're saying to one guy, if you don't cooperate with me, the other guy's going to squeal on you, and you're going to do time, right? Whereas they're also saying the exact same thing to the other guy. So now the prisoners have a dilemma. They have to figure out what the best thing that they can do is, right? Are they going to maintain their pact of silence with each other, even though they're in separate rooms and they don't know what the other person's really doing? Are the police lying to them or not? They might be, they might not be. Are we going to maintain our pact of silence? Am I going to preemptively spill the beans on my friend because it looks like he might be spilling the beans on me? I'm going to betray him. The rational thing to do from a prisoner's dilemma perspective is for both parties, unfortunately, to betray each other, because that's the terms the police have offered. The police are going to get you off with a lighter sentence if you betray your friend. But if, obviously, that creates a less than optimal outcome for both prisoners, because if neither of them spilled the beans, they would walk away scot-free. Nation states in that sense are caught in this prisoner's dilemma. The optimal thing to do would be to cooperate, but we don't know what the other person's doing. We don't know what the other person's intending, and because of that so-called shadow of the future, we put the priority on survival at all costs. And so you do what you have to do, not because you want to. You don't want to betray your fellow prisoner, but because there's only really one rational outcome, and that is that you have to betray your fellow prisoner. So the key word here is rationality, right? That it's not a human nature thing; it's a rationality thing. We're acting rationally in a situation where we have no choice. The system of sovereign the system of sovereign states that we live in forces us to act because of the shadow of the future, and so if there is a tragedy here, it's not a tragedy of human nature. Human nature has nothing to do with it. It is the tragedy of our structure. It's the tragedy of the situation that we find ourselves in, and Howard goes into great detail about this, talking about the Melian dialogues and Athens versus Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And the point, I could spend a lot of time talking about that with you, but the point seems to be just basically that a lot of history has passed since the time of the Athenians, and today it's basically the same model, that basically only the names have changed. It's still the same tragic circumstances repeating itself over and over, and the wheel of history has not really done anything else other than to bring us perpetually back to the same condition. That said, you may be scratching your heads at this point, because there's one vital thing that he's saying, and if you've preempted me that's fair. But I think you cannot conclude your conversation about this piece without remarking on his discussion towards the end of the transformations of the industrial era. And the key question he seems to be asking at the end of the piece is, has the advent of nuclear weapons changed the dynamics? Has the advent of industrialization changed the dynamics? And I think, I think he's admitting that it probably has. But what he's suggesting is that, not everyone may agree or understand that. So some people may still think that they can achieve more through war. And if they think they can achieve more through war, then that's what they'll pursue. The difference that nuclear weapons makes, though, is that if you were to use nuclear weapons, of course, you wouldn't achieve more. War in general achieves more for you in a world of anarchy. Certainly, the pursuit of power achieves more for you in a world of anarchy from this perspective. Yes, definitely, right? But if you use nuclear weapons, then of course everyone dies in the attempt, including yourself. So possibly, from a realist perspective, there's a good argument then to suggest that nuclear weapons create what's called MAD, or mutually assured destruction, which is a kind of a paradoxical piece. That is to say, a peace that exists not because anyone's feeling particularly peace-like or peace-loving, but because, again, rationality pervades, and it doesn't matter if you're Iran or Russia or China or the USA, and all of these countries have very different ideologies and ideological purposes, but again, they want to survive. More than anything else, they want to survive so they can continue to pursue their way of lives, even though those ways of life are very, very different, and they may hate people who have different ways of life than them. Those civilizations, those countries, have very different priorities, of course, in terms of their values, but no one wants to be dead. So, from that perspective, nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran, and I'm just trying to relate Howard to this debate again. He, of course, doesn't really talk much about Iran, but the point would be that there's nothing to fear about Iranian nuclear weapons. They're not any more likely to use them than Russia was or that China was. Many policymakers said that the Russians were crazy and that they could not be trusted. It's just 50 years passed and there was no nuclear war with Russia, and there still is no nuclear war with Russia because it's just not viable. Why would you want to destroy the whole planet? It's not rational. So Iran is no more likely to be like that than Russia was, or that North Korea has been up to this point in time. So okay. Right, on this slide we have Andrew Abasovic, and it's a great little piece. I hope you liked it. And he seems to start by agreeing with Michael Howard that there was a time in the sort of history of the United States where it was perceived that war worked, and this is something, of course, that Howard, I think, has been quite clear on. That war has had a rational basis in the way international relations works, and I think that's something that Abasovic, I think, largely sort of would concur with, right? And Abasovic, I don't think, is a pacifist, but what he is interested in is how history can change, but ideologies can stay the same. And of course, where the good war, so to speak, of fighting against fascist Germany resulted in major transformations for America, in the sense that the US became a great power through that war, and the war brought great prosperity to America, in the sense that it stimulated a massive, boom in domestic spending. It generated 30 years of unprecedented growth. It transformed the average family income of the country, and of course, it gave the country a massive capacity in production and technological innovation. which it's still benefiting from even years later. So there is a sense that, you know, this was that World War II was a major historical turning point in the fate of America as a nation. But one thing Abasovic is warning about and complaining about is how, you know, ideas that war works can be misinterpreted somehow. Remember that Howard isn't so much saying or caring whether there's good guys or bad guys. He's just saying that war is sort of the structural outcome of how we are organized politically around the planet in nation states. And in that sense, yeah, war works because war is how we fix our problems and get our problems resolved sometimes in that structure, inevitably. And that's kind of like almost like an objective or scientific way of describing it. Basovic's problem is that we kind of lost track of that objective stance on war, and especially in the United States, after World War II, we developed instead what he calls a grand narrative of power and moral purpose. And he quotes Tony Judt, who has this concept of the moral memory palace. And this is, of course, I suppose, the palace of the mind, where all your memories are stored and where you go into your mind to find your treasured memories. And in the national moral conscience, the national moral memory palace for the United States of America, we find this grand narrative, not of the utility of war from Michael Howard's perspective, which we remember is kind of objective and not really about good guys and bad guys, but rather instead very much a narrative about good guys and bad guys, a narrative that the United States saved the world in World War II, that the war had been a good idea, that the war worked, and that the good guys had won and that all was well. And what I think Abasovic is trying to challenge is that that is kind of a simplistic notion of how world history has worked over the last century. And so to argue and demonstrate for us and illustrate for us the distinction, he describes what he calls the two 20th centuries. And the first one, I suppose, would be, if you're familiar with him, maybe again from an international relations class you may have taken, it would be, you know, exemplary of the work of Francis Fukuyama, for example, but also certainly, you know, people like Thomas Friedman he quotes, whose book is The Olive and the Lexus Tree, you know, very, very relevant to our story here. And those characters generally would be advocates of what's called the short 20th century hypothesis, right? That this is to say that, you know, the century ended in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that kind of sealed the final victory of the moral order and global order that the United States had sacrificed in World War II to start building, and 40, 50 years later had successfully created. And that after 1989, everyone would want to be, living in a democratic capitalist society, basically pursuing the American way of life with Marlboro cigarettes and blue jeans and Coca-Cola and Budweiser beer. Because that's utopia, right? That's what everyone all over the world wants. Abasovic, I think, is just basically trying to say that that's kind of a naive approach because it ignores a lot of history, actually. And, he's very powerful at the end of this piece, and he says, one of the most important things that a historian can do for students, not that I'm a historian, I'm a political scientist, whatever, but, I take the point seriously all the same, is that, we can, use facts for positive effect, right? We use our methods, use our tools as academics to create positive change in the world, to correct incorrect knowledge, right? And so how he's going to do that in this piece is by bringing in this notion of a different 20th century, what he calls a long 20th century. And he says, especially if you look at the Middle East, you can see that this century is played out very differently, where even today, much longer, way past 1989, we see legacy events. We see the legacies of events that took place in the 20th century continuing to have major political repercussions. And this is a very important sort of point, because it really responds strongly to the assertions of people like George W. Bush, who sort of asserted that the problem in the Middle East was simply the presence of dictators and evildoers and people like, mini little Adolf Hitler's dictators of these various countries, and that somehow if we just got rid of them, decapitated the regimes, that democracy would spontaneously flower up from underneath. I think Abasovic is trying to really dismiss that argument and show it as false. So the distinction, he sort of starts drawing these distinctions and says that, that basically the difference between the short 20th century and the long 20th century is that the short 20th century was largely a game in which the participants were all equal powers. They were all Western powers, and so they were great powers. Certainly World War I, World War II, featured battles between them all, and at the end there were just two guys left, the Russians and the United States. But game two, which is the long 20th century, is different. That's specifically about the Middle East, and it's specifically about not equal powers, but the role of what he calls outsiders, outside imperial forces that have intervened to shape the human geography and also historical evolution of the people in this area. And so in that framework, it's not so much about evildoers and mini Adolf Hitlers, but rather about a situation in which Western powers have consistently contrived to intervene, to organize, to arrange, to colonize, to govern, to extract oil, and to maintain a system that's favorable to their long-term agenda and interests of being able to continue to obtain that oil. So the short 20th century and the long 20th century, then, morally speaking, the short 20th century is how most Americans tend to see American power today. They see it as a continuation of that moral victory of the short 20th century, which was over the Third Reich, where we were the good guys. And of course, Abasovic has some caution on that note. He's not even sure that that's true, because of course, if you look at, that's not to disavow anything that Hitler did, but it's to suggest that the Allies were not too hesitant to carry out their own atrocities in World War II. As he says, and this is a historical fact, the Allies knew about the Holocaust. They did nothing to try to stop it. They firebombed Dresden. They dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They abandoned their former allies to the Soviets. They sanctioned ethnic cleansing in places in the Balkans. And of course, domestically, in the United States, for example, there was no effort to really address the racial issues that were ongoing in American culture, which were, very, very murderous at the time and bloodthirsty. So, is it really so clean-cut as good guys versus bad guys? The worst thing I think he sort of feels, however, despite all that, the worst thing that the great powers did was that they, and it's very much evident in the way American history since World War II is narrated, is that the geopolitical realities and actualities of the Cold War were buried. As he says, facts matter. And it's very important that we understand that the way that most Americans imagine and understand the Cold War with the USSR is really just one reading, and there are alternative ways of reading that history that have nothing to do with the moral victory over Nazi Germany, and everything to do with the legacy of the geopolitical sort of forces that are at work in the world today, which are namely the rivalry during the Cold War, at least anyway, the rivalry of the great powers one thing he's interested to mention is that, in a sense, we're dealing with, and I use my term here, not his, but we're dealing with kind of like a zombie myth. When you look at people like Thomas Friedman and their writings, you see that this zombie myth, the myth that won't die, the myth of America's sort of moral purpose in the world, that America's a good guy, one of the good guys, and that if it uses force for enlightened purposes, not because it wants power, but because it's got a special mission to bring peace and enlightenment to the world. This is really upsetting Abasovic, right? And because he believes that it's that attitude that got the United States into war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the idealism that was on display when President Bush said that Saddam Hussein was an evildoer, and when serious commentators, both like Bush and his various sort of advisors, but also people like Tony Blair, basically used language that implied that Hitler was, present in the context, right? That basically Saddam Hussein was a kind of a Hitler type, and of course, that Chamberlain was sort of accused of having appeased Hitler at the start of World War II, and this idea of appeasement was once again on display. It was a ubiquitous part of the debates. So, where has it left us? Today, we are, still in it, right? It's the longest war in U.S. history. There's that I can tell, no end in sight. Iraq's not stable, particularly, and Afghanistan is still very much an active situation. So, Americans will continue to read the conundrum of the present moment as a continuation of the legacy of World War II, of America's moral purpose in World War II. But Abasovic argues in the conclusion that if that's the way we're going to live our history, then, as he says, the past is worse than dead. It's effectively, and this is why I use the word zombie. That it's a sort of a it's a creature that's come back from the dead to haunt us. As he says, it's a self-inflicted wound. It's a monster of our own creation, made of our own flesh, you might say. So finally, now we'll just move on to the Singer piece, and it's a fairly straightforward piece. I don't have a lot to add that you wouldn't get very quickly from reading it yourselves. I know you'll probably agree with me if I say that there's some crossover here with Glenn Greenwald, but the real question is kind of, again, sort of going to that sort of point that Glenn Greenwald imagined about the internet not just being any ordinary technology. The internet is a technology that makes us different as a species, right? That it's very transformative technology. Greenwald's very good on this. If the printing press gave us literacy, and literacy changed who we are, we were no longer sort of medieval people told what to do and what to believe by our priests and kings, but we became thinkers on our own. Well, the internet even allows us to do that in a much more dramatic sense. It allows us to become virtual beings, to not just to learn new things, but to express our very selves differently in these virtual spaces in all kinds of experimental and creative ways. Well, I think one of the things that Singer is trying to explore is, well, what does war look like in a virtual world? What does the way we represent the world to ourselves look like? I.e., what does mapping look like when the technological change has become so quick and so rapid that the maps can't seem to keep up with the way we interact with our planet? He talks a lot of length about sea power, sort of having changed the way we industrial development gave us the power to, go to war under the ocean, and above the sea, above the land, in the air. But the newer technologies, the virtual technologies, specifically drones and robots, as an expression of our new virtual world, have really created major changes for how we feel about war and how we relate to our security. The technological change effectively means that we can kind of perpetually delay the declaration of war. And this is a big problem for him, because basically it allows us to effectively be at war while pretending that we are not at war. And so for example, he complains about the fact that Congress is doing nothing while the president, the executive branch, be it Bush or be it Obama, both of them have been engaging in this kind of practice. That we've bypassed the Vietnam War era so-called War Powers Resolution, which was really just a reaffirmation of what the Constitution already says, right? Which is that Congress is the only branch by law that can declare war. But the United States hasn't declared war since, I think, World War II or the Korean War. Now, the United States has been in a lot of wars since then, but it hasn't sort of actively declared a war. So I think the key point that he's making ultimately is that these new technologies, especially drones, because they are unmanned, they effectively allow the executive branch to, on the strength of technicalities, to really avoid the clause in the War Powers Resolution wherein I think the executive branch is supposed to go to Congress for approval of military action if that military action is going to last longer than a few weeks. By for example, in Libya, because there were unmanned drones flying over Libya, the executive didn't feel any obligation to start the clock on the need to go to Congress. They were able to do the whole thing remotely, and it was only when subsequently, when manned aircraft started to be used over the skies of Libya, that the clock to get involved, to go to Congress, started. So, the real question then today is, how long can we remain so disconnected from the real price of these wars? Joseph Stiglitz calculates that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have cost the U.S. taxpayer, by the time another 10 years have passed, that the total cost will be $4 trillion, which is just, huge money. Right now we're paying for that largely through borrowings. This is a problem, says Singer. In the past we would declare war. And I think he's trying to call attention to the fact that these drones allow us to be kind of hypocritical. If we're at war, let's declare war, right? Let's not let the fact that we're using robots do the fighting for us hide the reality that sometimes someday somebody's going to have to pay for this, and they're not just free, right? The bloodshed they cause, the innocent civilians that they kill, and there have been many, have families, and those families will have bitterness and emotional baggage from their loss moving forward. And you have to ask if the drones ultimately are counterproductive. Are they a recruiting tool for the terrorists that would sort of serve to attack American interests down the road? So there you go, guys. That's the lecture for week 3. Give me a shout if there's any issues. I want to commend you again on the great journals you did last week. hoping to see some good journals again this week. It was a pleasure reading them, and I hope this lecture is good. And I look forward to seeing your conversation on Wednesday and Thursday in the discussion forum. Thank you very much.